Put very simply, inheritance is merely the ability of one class to derive functionality from another class. So if I've got a class that provides and defines some basic functionality that I want to use elsewhere, I can derive another class from it, and all of the structure and content of that class will be derived or inherited by that subclass. So the source of the content is referred to as the base class. This is where the content's actually coming from. And the recipient of that content is called the subclass or derived class. Now we actually have a number of different terms that we can use. For the base class, you'll often sometimes hear the term superclass or parent class. For the subclass, you'll hear terms such as child class as well as derived class. So there's a lot of terminology here. Most of it, however, is pretty intuitive. If we're going to allow inheritance to be a part of our model, however, it really has to be well designed. It needs to be designed very well from the very beginning. The idea really is that if I change any of the behaviors in that base class, then that means the subclasses will immediately see those changes. See, the content of the source class, the base class, is not actually compiled into the subclass, but rather the subclass makes a call up to the base class in order to access its content. So that means if the base class changes any of its behaviors, then the subclasses will be required to immediately work under those changes and assumptions. That means that if you make a change to a base class that doesn't make sense based on the way the subclass is created, then it could cause a problem. So it's important to make sure that if you use inheritance, it's very, very well designed, because this could cause, if you're not careful, more problems than good. Now, technically, every class that you create in C# derives from a class called object. Now, object is the base class that's really at the base of the entire object hierarchy in C#. So even if you don't physically and explicitly derive your class from any other base class, it does derive from object. And all the functionality that's in the object class will automatically be a part of every single class, no matter how it's physically inherited. Now, a derived class or a subclass will derive and inherit everything from its base class, with the exception of constructors and destructors. Sometimes you have elements that are available in that base class that are not actually visible because of their accessibility, such as a private member, for example, might be defined in the base class, but not actually accessible by the derived class. It still technically inherits to that derived class, but because of the accessibility issues, the derived class is not actually able to access that functionality directly. Now, in C#, we use a single inheritance model, and that means that a derived class can never be more accessible than its base class, and the derived class can, at most, have one base class. So that means that I could not derive a subclass that comes from two different or three different base classes and then aggregate their functionality together. I'm not allowed to do that. And I'm not allowed to make that derived class more accessible than its base class, because that would provide additional exposure to some of those methods in the base class, which may not really be valid. Now, if you like to, you can change. This is referred to as overriding. You can change or add to the members of the base class. So if you want to modify some of the members that are defined by the base class, or if you want to add additional members to that base class from the derived class location, you can do that in your inheritance plan.